so how was it? And I said, it was interesting. And she's like, oh, did you? And I said, well, I said, do you know anybody by the name of Mary Schofield? And she's like, no, I've never heard of that name before. And she goes, we know there's a ghost of a little girl here, and we know, those kinds of things. And I'm like, no, there's a woman here, and this is her name. And so the very next day, we got home, it was fairly late, and I started doing some digging, and I went on to good old Google, and I tried her name a few different ways, and I found her. And the interesting thing was that wasn't the whole story at that time, but I found her. She was here in the Hamilton Asylum.
Oh.
In 1901, she was admitted to Hamilton Asylum for essentially what today we would say is dementia or Alzheimer's, which makes sense in my head because it was very foggy and she was really very focused on certain things, like very much so, didn't remember certain things, and then some things were really clear. But she got very easily agitated by things that she wasn't comfortable with. And so I found her at the Hamilton Asylum. So Mary Schofield was admitted in 1901 at the age of 59, and she passed away the same year. So I don't know why she passed away. It doesn't say why she passed away. I mean, dementia obviously could be or Alzheimer's could be the thing. I hope that she wasn't a party to, I don't think that she was. I think I may have felt that. But what a weird way to find out about the Hamilton Asylum is in a city, place that's over an hour away. But it was the local asylum for the time. And as I went to the archives the next day in town here, and I found out so much more about her, and why she was in that house was because her husband's sister was married to the owner of the home at the time. And I think that because it wasn't safe to leave her on her own in their own home, which is just about 8 blocks away, closer to the water, that she was brought there. Because the one thing when I found out about the door upstairs in the room, when I was working there later doing teaching drama camp for kids, the woman who was in charge of the building let me into the room upstairs, and it was an office today. But then it was like the ladies' sewing room. And there is a door there. The door is still on the inside, but they covered it over with drywall on the outside. So the door that she would have known is still there. But this new fire door, they knocked through the wall. It was not an existing door. It's just that they put it there because it was the closest to the top of the staircase. So if there ever was a fire, it was easier to get down the flight of stairs. But how weird was that I suspect that she would have spent a portion of her time in that room with the other ladies, just, towards the end of her life. Right. And and interestingly enough, the only other time she's ever come up is during some other people, I think, did an investigation there in either the late 90s or early 2000s, and they spotted her on the staircase. They said they actually saw the apparition, and when they described it, it sounded like her. So I believe that they picked up her apparition. Mm-hmm. But what a weird thing. But because this asylum was the only thing in the region other than the one in London, this was where she ended up being sent. Now she is buried here in town at the cemetery, the big cemetery outside of town. I go and see her when we do our walking tours out that way, and we always put a little coin or something on top of her top of her headstone. But there's so much more to that story than just that. But that connection that led us back to this facility again after we had moved from the city out of town. Yeah, this story just tied right back into this facility, right? But I know when I walked the grounds there, that one point, just, the nature of it for me, it's difficult to be on these sites. It's just all encompassing and overwhelming, and the energy, the residual energy and everything too. I just found that, it's a, I don't want to say it's an active site like, ooh, spooky ghost going to jump out at you, but man, does it have a lot of residual energy on the site. And that, knocking the buildings down doesn't make that go away.
No, absolutely not.
No. So I wonder with the new facility, like, I don't know. I mean, it's a hard thing to think about, the difficulties that people went through in asylums. And I don't know if you've ever read, Nellie Bly, stories of
No,
Nellie Bly. In
no.
the late 1800s, Nellie Bly was a woman journalist, not very common in those days. But wow, she was a spectacularly adventurous young woman. She actually went out of her way to get herself committed to end up in the asylum in New York City. So on the island, I think I'm not sure that it was on Rikers, it was on one of the other islands. But she managed to get herself committed so that she could see what life was like inside the asylum.
Holy jeez.
Yeah. And it was a real story for her just to end up being committed. She actually had to do things that were seemingly normal because she didn't want to come across like an absolute raging lunatic, because then they wouldn't put her there, right? Weirdly enough, she had to have, and she couldn't have herself committed. That was the funny thing. So she had to find somebody to commit her, but it had to be over a period of time, because apparently they didn't just randomly, unless it was your husband calling and going, hey, my wife is crazy, put her away. It needed sort of a long term. So she ended up getting a room in a women's rooming house. And then she went to work at a box factory with the girls in the house. So she got this position. She started there, and she started to do things that were pretty normal by today's standards. But in those days, not so much. She was complaining about work conditions and that it was too dim and it was hard to see, and that they needed more than one light on at any given time, or one candle, and these kinds of things, like just things that she happened to notice. And so, I mean, you can read her story, because even today you can go online and you can Google Nellie's story, and it's so fascinating to find out what she experienced. And her editor from the newspaper was actually the one that ended up coming to bail her out of the asylum after, I believe, she was there for 10 days. And she got out, he came, and essentially that was their plan, right? She would spend the time in there and she would write this tell-all article about the asylum. And it's pretty frightening what happened to her in the asylum.
I'm sure.
Just in terms of the way they treated her, and had no regard for women's lives whatsoever. Just some of the ladies that she ended up going in with, she's fairly certain were dead within a day or two from the harshness of the treatments. Some of them couldn't speak any English. There was a German woman who spoke no English, and just like, how terrifying would that be? That you come to a country, you don't speak the language, and you end up in an asylum. And you have no recourse, because nobody's going to speak German to you. Nobody's going to speak any other language other than English. And even with Nellie, who was an intelligent young woman, she still had, I mean, and I think that's the thing that's so fascinating yet terrifying about these buildings. Early on, we feel like, mental health today, we're still hearing about things that happen in the mental health system. But I don't know, it's like we talk about this one, and it's like, yes, it had a farm and it had all of these things, and it had, but what if you were one of those non-functioning people who couldn't
exactly
day to day? Like, what happened to you in these facilities, right? I mean, nothing good from the sounds of it. I mean,
yeah
I think that's why there's such a hotbed for activity too, is that it's a high duress situation kind of system, and they would have been at a level of functioning that perhaps would allow them to do that. But we have this, like, I know when I first walked on the grounds of this place, it was overwhelming. Like, I was just overwhelmed. And the only other place that I can think of that I felt even worse was the Mush Hole, the residential school in Six Nations. Horrific. The very first time I ever walked on the property of that, it was just gut-wrenching fear and crying and tears and it was kind of the same thing here too, but I could process it a little better because it wasn't children.
Yeah.
It was adults. And so, but when you read about the stories here too, and like the feeling here of, there was one, and I don't know, maybe you might be able to help me with this, Ian, because you worked there. When I was on the property, I'm going to say it was maybe 2006 or 2007. So I remember the main part of the building, but I don't remember the sides of it anymore. I think that all that was gone, right? Century sits behind it. Was there other buildings besides Century at that time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You had what was the main complex of the hospital.
Okay.
And attached. Now, when I say the main complex, I'm talking about what was there in the 90s.
Okay.
Which was built back in the 50s or 60s or whatever it was.
Yeah, so there was some newer stuff there, yes.
Yeah, but attached to that building, the main facility was one of the old original buildings. It was called Grove Hall.
Oh, okay.
And it was actually a recreational facility for the patients. It was a gymnasium. They could go in there and play volleyball or shoot some basketball hoops. And
right, yeah, it was like a recreation
now center. What that building originally was, I don't know, but in the 90s it had been converted to a recreational facility. And then in behind that, as a separate building, there was another building in between that and Century.
Okay, yeah, because I remember a few other buildings being on the site, but I also remember and it's been a long time, but from what I could remember is that there was other buildings where Century was too. Like, it wasn't just Century like it is now, right? Like, it's standing alone like this. There were other buildings on the ends of it, and then there was another building behind it. And I remember that, walking around. It was a nice sunny summer day when we walked through, right? But it was just overwhelming. And I feel
there's this is where my paranormal connection comes in. There's another building that still exists.
Okay.
That is from 1891, which is when the original facility would have been there. And this is actually located across the street.
Yeah, by Mohawk.
Where the Hamilton Mohawk College campus is now, and it's part of the college campus. And as you mentioned, the hospital was a self-sustaining facility, farmland. They grew their own crops. And this building that still exists today across the street, it was a cold storage facility.
Oh, okay.
For the produce and the crops that would have been harvested on the farmland. And as I say, it is now been adapted into the college campus.
Right? Yeah.
And it's ironically called the cellar.
Oh,
which is what it was, and they still call it the cellar these days. And what it is, it's become a campus restaurant.